Over the previous 2 weeks, I've been greeting you in different languages from all around the world, and several of you wrote to me thanking me for these greetings. I'd like to return the thank yous by answering the questions that some of you have been sending me along with your thank you notes. Here's one. Hev Ilode, I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, from Eritrea, asks an interesting question. Professor Raj, if we shouldn't eat at night as part of the healthy lifestyle, why do they put a light in the fridge? This is a very good question, Hev Ilode, and I have to confess that I'm stumped. I would say, however, that you shouldn't let that light spoil your resolve to lead a healthy lifestyle. Remove the light if you have to. Well, back to the course. Believe it or not, we are down to week 4 of your heroic journey, the last week. Given how far we have come, it's only appropriate that I transport you back in time to circa 1969 to be precise, which also happens to be my favorite time in history. Why? Because of Woodstock, flower power, and classic rock, of course. Things were so far out and groovy back then. 1969 was also the year that one of the most famous psychology experiments of all time was conducted by Professor Philip Zimbardo of Stanford. Here's what Professor Zimbardo did. He left 2 cars, one in the Bronx in New York and another in Palo Alto, California, on the streets. There was a big difference between the 2 cars though. The one in Bronx did not have a license plate, its hood was up as if the car had been abandoned, and the one in Palo Alto, by contrast, looked to be in good condition, like a normal car. Zimbardo then sat back to observe what would happen to these 2 cars. He wanted to see how long it would take for the cars to be vandalized. Here's what happened. The car in the Bronx was vandalized almost immediately. A family with a young child removed the battery and the radiator first, and by the same time the next day, the whole car had been stripped. By contrast, the car in Palo Alto was intact. No one had touched it until Zimbardo went and smashed one of the windows of the car. Soon after that, that car too was vandalized. It's from this experiment that we get the famous term broken window theory. The theory that the context or the environment has a huge influence on our behaviors. When we find ourselves in a clean environment, surrounded by people behaving in a civilized and orderly way, we too behave in a civilized and orderly fashion. However, when we find ourselves in disorganized or unclean settings in which people engage in uncivil behavior, we mimic those uncivil behaviors. In other words, people are not set in their ways, with saintly people always behaving in a saintly fashion and sinners always behaving in a sinful fashion. Rather, although we may have a default propensity to be saintly or sinful, we are capable of exhibiting quite a wide range of behaviors around that default tendency. So even saints can turn into sinners under certain conditions and vice versa. This idea that the context or environment has a powerful influence on our behaviors is perhaps the single biggest theme to emerge from all of psychology in the past few decades. Let me demonstrate this idea through a thought experiment now. Imagine that you're participating in a game with a total stranger. In the game, you're given $10 to begin with, which you have to now split between yourself and the stranger. Imagine further that you and the stranger are put in separate rooms. You will never get to meet the stranger. Finally, imagine that you can split the $10 in any way you want. You can keep $9.99 for yourself and only give the stranger 1 cent, or you could split it more evenly, like $5 each. How much money will you give to the stranger in this game? And will the amount you give depend on what the game is called? Specifically, will it make a difference whether the game is called a community game versus Wall Street game? You would think that the name of the game wouldn't make a difference, right? But turns out it does. Researchers found that when a game like this is called community game, people give much more than when it is called Wall Street game. Once again, showing that the environment, in this case the name of the game, wields a powerful influence on our behaviors. What implications do these results have for our topic? Well, they imply that one of the most important determinants of employee happiness and behavior is organizational culture, because culture defines the features of the environment in which employees operate. This means that we need to understand which type of culture increases employee happiness and which ones decrease it. The difference between a happiness-enhancing culture and a happiness-deflating one boils down to two simple words: abundance and scarcity. A happiness-enhancing culture is characterized by a sense of abundance, which is the fifth and the last determinant of employee happiness in our PAMBA model. In an abundance culture, employees feel that their own success doesn't have to come at a cost to someone else's. Employees in such a culture feel that we are in this together, so they treat their co-workers as part of an extended family. Like Lorena Porto Pereira, CEO of Hospital Anchieta, did when her hospital hit their profit targets in 2017. Here's Carla Furtado, whom we met in week 1, to tell us more about it. By the way, it isn't just a kind and generous thing to treat employees like Lorena did. It is often also a smart thing to do. Why? Because being generous and abundance-minded promotes cooperation among employees. Employees are more willing to share helpful information with each other and proactively step in to do another person's job when required to, etc. The idea of putting client before company and others before self is a hallmark of abundance culture, and such a culture promotes employee happiness. By contrast, scarcity orientation deflates employee happiness. In a scarcity-oriented culture, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Employees feel that for me to win, somebody else definitely has to lose. This leads to hyper-competition among them. It also makes employees less trusting of each other. Employees in a scarcity culture are constantly engaged in one-upmanship, trying to show how much better they are than the others. Such a culture not only lowers employee happiness, it also lowers the organization's chances of success, particularly in the long run. If organizational culture is so important for happiness, we obviously need to understand how it's manifested. And organizational culture is manifested in 3 main domains. The first and most important is employee treatment. How are employees treated? How are they hired and fired? How are they treated while they're still employed? And finally, how are employees lower down in the hierarchy treated by those higher up? The second domain is treatment of external stakeholders, in particular the treatment of customers, suppliers, and the community at large. The third and final domain is organizational priorities. Specifically, does the organization prioritize employee well-being or profits? Does it prioritize intrinsic or extrinsic rewards? And does it prioritize long-term or a short-term orientation? As we'll see in the next video, the answers to these questions reveal a lot about an organization's culture. See you soon.